This striking painting of a young woman is called a mummy portrait. Mummy portraits are a group of objects from Egypt which were affixed to mummified bodies as part of the burial ritual. They were painted on linen shrouds and wooden boards. About 1,000 mummy portraits exist today, but fewer than 10% of them are still attached to their mummies. None of the mummies have ever been found in a definite primary context. Instead, they come from shallow pits and reused tombs. They are found mostly in northern or lower Egypt, but in great abundance in the Fayum region, which is how they got their colloquial name, the Fayum portraits. The Fayum region is just southwest of Cairo. It's a miniature oasis centered on a body of salt water called Lake Moeris in antiquity. Major find sites include the ancient cities of Hawara, Erubayet, and Philadelphia in the Fayum, and Antinopolis in Middle Egypt. Egypt was ruled by the Ptolemies, a dynasty of Greek origin, from 332 to 30 BCE. The famous Cleopatra VII was a Ptolemy, and it was after her death in 30 BCE that Egypt became a Roman province. The period from this year until 395 CE, when the Roman Empire split into two halves, is called the Roman period. All of the Fayum portraits date to this period, roughly between the mid-1st and later 3rd centuries CE. The subjects of the portraits are thought to have been part of a local elite class, possibly descended in part from Greek soldiers and civilians settled in the Fayum by the first Ptolemies. But the population during the Ptolemaic rule was mixed, about 1/3 Hellene, which meant not Greek but foreigner, and 2/3 Egyptian. And so the people living in the Fayum during the Roman period were probably of mixed heritage. This was not the only burial practice undertaken among this population, but it seems to reflect the preference of some people for more realistic images than had been traditional under the Egyptian pharaohs. The portrait custom can be best understood as the sum of Greek, Roman, and Egyptian parts. The Greek part is the painting style, the color palette of reds and yellows, the use of three-quarter poses, which imitate Greek busts, and the attempt at three-dimensionality are all elements of the style championed by the Greek artist Apelles in the 4th century BCE. The Roman components of the portrait tradition are mostly funerary and ceremonial. The display of masks of the dead in the homes of elites and in temples is known from the Roman world, as are meals with the dead, especially on the anniversary of the death. The mummies are thought to have been entombed in subterranean catacombs with banqueting rooms above them, so that they could join their relatives for meals on special occasions. Roman wall paintings from Pompeii and imperial portraiture also echo the style of the mummy portraits. Lastly, the Egyptian share of this practice is the mummification. Preserving the body for the afterlife was considered strange by some Roman authors who did not live in Egypt. Embalming had been compared with the salting of fish. But the Greco-Egyptian population, which prepared their dead in this way, had been in Egypt for centuries, and had come to practice some parts of the Egyptian religion. However, Roman period mummification was far from perfect. In most cases, the internal organs were left inside the body, and in others we find that the body had decayed for several years before being embalmed. Let's talk for a moment about technique. The paintings were made on linen shrouds, which were wrapped around the body, or, more commonly, on thin wooden panels. The panels needed to be thin enough to bend across the face of the mummy so that they could be inserted into the wrappings. Elaborate wrapping patterns were common. Sometimes they would be decorated with gold and plaster appliques, for example with figures of ancient Egyptian gods. The paintings were made by one of two techniques. The first is encaustic, a wax-based medium mixed with either resin or egg, used either hot or cold. Here the wax was stretched and melted onto the canvas by a series of hard tools, pins, and brushes. The second technique is tempera, where the pigment has been mixed with a water-soluble binding agent and applied with brushes. Elements like laurel wreaths and jewelry, as with the necklace you see here, were often gilded. The paintings represent people of all ages and both sexes, as well as people of certain professions, identifiable by their dress, such as priests and soldiers. In addition to dress, we can use hairstyles, particularly those of women, to date these paintings, because the fashions in Egypt evidently followed Roman imperial fashions fairly closely. There is evidence that some paintings were made from models, and a portrait with instructions for delivery on the back suggests that some paintings traveled long distances to meet the body. Very few of the portraits bear any text, but the portrait of the boy Eutyches is a notable exception. It is a painting of a young boy which bears an inscription in ink, not paint. This means that the text was probably written by someone other than the artist. The inscription across the top of his tunic reads, in Greek, which was the common language at the time, Eutyches, freedman of Kassanios. This implies that the painting was used as a document testifying to Eutyches being freed by his master. This is extraordinary in and of itself, and it also shows that even former slaves were allowed to have portraits if someone could pay for them. But what follows in the inscription is also exemplary. Another name, and the phrase, "I signed." This might refer to the person who witnessed Eutyches being freed, but it could also be the only attestation of an artist's signature on any of the Fayum portraits. Eutyches' portrait naturally leads us to the debate about when a portrait was made during the life of the subject. Some paintings do seem to show people who might have been near death, but others are attached to bodies which expired far later in life than their portraits would suggest. The only fair conclusion at this time is that each case was different. Some people might have commissioned their portraits in their prime and hung them in their homes until they died. Others might have commissioned them when they knew death was near. And still others, for whatever reason, might not have been painted from life at all.